Hello, welcome to the FinTech Times Present series of webinars. Established in 2016, the FinTech Times is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading FinTech newspaper. We report on the latest and brightest ideas from the FinTech world. To discuss today, we're going to be discussing fraud and how fraudsters use the collaborative effect and how we should start using the collaborative effect to actually fight them. It'd be great if you could follow us at the FinTech Times on Twitter and join in the conversation. So really happy to have two experts with me, Carey and David. I'm going to ask them both to give them a short introduction, and then we'll get on with the conversation.
Sure. So my name is Carey Kolaja. I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer for AU10TIX, which is identity intelligence company headquartered out of Israel.
Hi, I'm Dave Birch. I'm an author, advisor and commentator on digital financial services, and I'm a member of the advisory board of AU10TIX.
It's wonderful. It's really great to have you both here and to have a conversation with you. Appreciate you both taking the time.
Thank you.
So we're kind of here to talk a little bit about sort of fraud and identity, etc. I wanted to just sort of start off, maybe start off with David. Sort of generally, what have you sort of seen in this pandemic sort of time frame that we've been involved in now? What's the sort of main factors and things that have been going on?
Well, I think a lot of people have told you the same thing, Mark, which is for many people, the virus has accelerated trends that were there anyway. So it's not that it's changed people's thinking, but it's pushed people into doing things that they would have done, downstream. So it's accelerated the trends towards digital onboarding, the use of digital identities, remote transactions, this kind of thing. And for many companies, I mean, none of them would have wanted it to happen this way, of course. But for many companies, it's sort of proved, their proposition, like what they were saying, it's a better way of working. And there's a couple of triggers for that, really. One is the obvious one, which is the virus forcing people to work at home and companies having to go online to deal with customers that had never been online before. We all understand that part. But I think one thing that might not be as recognized is the FATF guidelines in March were changed to say Financial Action Task Force guidelines to do with remote onboarding and identification of people. They were changed in March to say in many circumstances digital identification of people is actually better than physical identification, not just equivalent to, or you can use it instead of in temporary circumstances, but a recognition that the technology has advanced to the point where it's actually better to deal with people this way. So when you put those two things together, it's not surprising that you're seeing in our industry anyway, a real acceleration.
Yeah. And obviously, Carey, with obviously your company's real focus on the sort of like identity market authentication, what sort of trends have you seen sort of emerge that maybe you didn't see before the lockdown?
Yeah, Mark, I mean, I would just echo what David said. It's, this drive, this acceleration to digital dependency is not surprising to see where we're starting to see fraud and where we're starting to see trends that were unexpected. I will say that I read an article a couple of weeks ago and they talked about the top 30 trends that they're seeing growth in, and many of them, fit squarely in where fraud or digital identity becomes more and more paramount, and it becomes a absolute necessity that we find ways, whether it's technologies or processes or regulation in order to protect people's identities. And, of those top 30, biometrics was one, cybersecurity was another, contactless payments, telehealth, video conference, all requiring some sort of verification method. And in our space, we've primarily been in payments and cryptos and the sharing economy, all that took, digital identity absolutely is a critical component of protecting their businesses, which is what we're in the business of doing, is helping businesses provide safer and more secure services to their customers. And where the financial sector, as you know, has for years and decades been fighting fraud. And digital identity has been critical, whether it's done in a physical form or in a digital form. I think the trend that I'm seeing and what's concerning if we don't do it the right way are industries that haven't looked at fraud, as an underpinning for them providing safer services. And now they're being forced to. So healthcare is a great example of that. Education's a great example of that. I think even video conferencing. I mean, I think we all saw in the news what happened with Zoom and Zoom bombing when everybody came online. And, you know, how do you verify that you are who you say you are, Mark? I mean, I know that from my own research, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of information that's being shared and transacted in different means that never really took into an account verifying, authenticating, and authorizing people to engage in that transaction.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think there's obviously in what we're seeing a lot of, and I've read in some of the articles from yourself, is obviously that fraudsters are using collaboration a lot to actually sort of intensify and improve their methods. And I understand, obviously, you have the new platform Instinct that you've brought out, which is obviously also looking at sort of a form of collaboration to fight back with that. I really like the actual phrase that I think you came up to with this: the fraudsters succeed in penetrating their crimes through collaboration, and why shouldn't we fight back in that way? Which is really good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly it. And David and I have talked about this a lot, that, you know, fraud is a continuous collaborative fight, and fraudsters create rings around the world and through different means in order to penetrate systems and to penetrate situations. And they are using really sophisticated technology. And as we all talk about, whether in the financial sector or others that are fighting fraud, that, you know, they're using technologies that are at the cutting edge. And this is where we're starting to see the emergence of synthetic fraud and deep fakes and types of fraud that are harder and harder for you to detect, whether it's with the human eye or with very sophisticated algorithms and machine learning. And about 2 years ago, actually, the founder and CEO, Ron Atzman, had this idea of creating a collaborative ecosystem where we can fight fraud together, because as we know, a fraudster will try to penetrate one network or one system and then go and penetrate others using the same ID or only changing a small element of that ID. And so we said, why can't we reverse engineer this and do this together? And that was, you know, born Instinct. And one of the reasons why we, you know, humbly felt that we were in a position to do this is when you look at the brands that we serve and we have served for the last 10 years, and even before that, particularly when we were in airport security and border control, we have an incredible reach. And so what it required was for us to create the right technology and to ensure we've got the right mechanism in which we're protecting customer data and not saving customer data, so that our customers, i.e. the businesses, felt comfortable opting in to the network.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Sort of coming to you a little bit, David. Obviously, you know, you're, I think you're classified as a thought leader in digital identity and digital money. You know, obviously, was this approach inevitable as we move towards more of a digital money solutions and digital things?
I think it's inevitable for a couple of reasons, and I think the way AU10TIX have responded to it is actually a little bit different. So it's just, why is it inevitable? It's inevitable because, I mean, people imagine that, you know, we're fighting hackers that are, you know, these kids in their bedrooms that are trying to get in and steal credit card numbers. It's a very nostalgic view of fraud. I mean, it's you know, Niall Ferguson, the historian, said, you know, the coming war is networks versus networks. You know, these are sophisticated networks that are attacking. And so we need networks to defend. It's the only way to get the strength that we need to do it. But we mustn't make things worse by you know, if we're going to get together, we mustn't share personal information and personal data and actually make the system worse in trying to defend against it. So I think, you know, what's sophisticated about, and by the way, we know that network approach works, because in the very limited case of credit card fraud, you see very successful companies in that space already, you know, threat metrics and so on. So we know the network approach works, albeit that was in a very kind of limited space, and we're dealing with a much bigger space. But we mustn't make things worse. So we have to be clever. And this is this point about sending these, you know, sending the signals around fraud and not sending personal information and personal data. And I think bringing those things together is what makes it a clever, you know, very clever use of the technologies, which, you know, I think will make a real difference to customers.
Yeah. Mark, I'd add to that, if you don't mind. I mean, David, I think, is really emphasizing something about not making things worse and making them better. And, you know, having been in product development and different positions for a number of years, product management, like, you're always trying to find this balance of, you know, safety and security and experience and growth. And, we have seen this real pivot, over the last couple of months, where a number of businesses have maybe emphasized a little bit of experience in getting people through the funnel. I mean, not at the cost of their business, clearly, but you look at tolerance levels of what are you willing to tolerate or not tolerate. And, there's been a real pivot clearly of, how do you get to both? And do you need to compromise both? And, each businesses go through these growth curves of, you need to be compliant. Are you managing towards risk? Are you managing towards experience? Are you managing towards growth? And as David said, like, we don't want to make it worse. We actually want to find ways to make it better. And so David and I talked quite a bit about, theoretically, do we think there could be a world where the actions that people need to take in order to protect themselves become less and less because it's happening behind the scenes, and it only happens at a point in time where the signals detect there may be a higher risk, or there may be conflicting behavior to what you had observed in the past? Again, very much like credit card fraud. When do you get, this interstitial of verify who you are, we think it's a fraudulent transaction? It more likely will happen the same way in identity fraud.
Yeah, I think
just to make one point about that, Carey, because obviously you're right about that, and I think that this point about the signals is a really strong point. But the sophistication of the attacks that we have to defend against mean, in the world of credit cards, I wouldn't say it's simple, but you know what I mean. It's like you're looking for, was this card used in a fraudulent transaction and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a much more sophisticated space, which is why it's much harder to get that balance right. And
right.
I think instinct does that. I think it is a new approach when it's taken out to that wider problem set.
Yeah. What I was going to sort of comment on is obviously, the sort of the concept of, single credit card fraud and that sort of stuff. There is a sort of like as Carey mentioned, a willingness for credit card companies, banks to almost expect a certain element of fraud, and to almost use it as there's a budget in their sort of P&L for fraudulent claims.
Losses. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And sort of obviously we kind of need to move away from that and get people thinking, well, actually don't need to sort of put up with that. That's sort of one thing,
Look, I don't want to kind of over dramatize, but the point is that's why you can't use the same, like, Carey's experience with PayPal is was at the forefront of this kind of approach of linking up data and a back end that could detect these things. But an acceptable level in credit card fraud, let's say, I don't know, we're going to accept 10 basis points or whatever, that's okay. But you can't say, well, we'll accept 1 in 10 bank accounts being open being fraudulent, or we'll accept only 1 in 100 terrorists gets on a plane or something like that. I mean, when you broaden it out, you need a much more sophisticated infrastructure.
Yeah, and the sort of the next thing that I'm sort of thinking of as well is that the sort of the concept of once a company or a joint of a couple of companies come up with some interesting ways of measuring and seeing these things, the whole idea of collaboration then really comes in for me, because you need to share what you've found and what you've seen. The best fraud systems in the world, if it's only owned by one bank and one identity company, is going to be great for them too, but useless for the whole industry. So what sort of obligation, Carey, do you feel with the new platform to sort of bring that data alive and available to sort of other areas?
I mean, it was the premise of Instinct, which is, organizations in the world fights fraud in very silo ways, whether it's for a business or for its function. And even in my early days at PayPal, when we were, making a number of acquisitions, whether it's Venmo and Braintree or it was some others, by the time you integrate those systems, you've got multiple ways in where fraud may be trying to penetrate your systems, and you're constantly fighting that off. And so this idea of how do we connect those signals and we unify the business community around global identity signals so we can fight fraud is absolutely paramount. And the responsibility, Mark, is really twofold. I mean, one, I'm a personal believer, and therefore this is where I put my career in us fighting fraud together. That's the way we're going to be doing it at scale. And that's the way we're going to be able to do it at the pace and at a faster pace than the fraudsters that are emerging. And as David said, like it's not these kids on the third floor of their home anymore. They're making a living doing this. But in doing that, we have an absolute responsibility in protecting information and protecting customers' data. And so what was unique about Instinct and why it took some time for us to create it is we do not keep any PII. So, and we don't do that for any of the services that we provide to our customers, albeit if they ask us to for a period of time, so we can always do a monitoring and a checks and balances of how we're performing for their business. But effectively what we do is we take a hash of the actual ID and we look at the signals and we hash that forward so it can't be reverse engineered and decrypted. And as businesses opt in, so we have over, I think 15% of our customer base already who's opted in, and they're at some form either sending us the signals now or plan on doing that. As they opt in, to your point, the network becomes more intelligent. Our ability to fight fraud across platforms, across markets become more intelligent. And with one of the capabilities that we have built, which effectively looks at retroactive signals, is deep fakes and synthetic fraud, they may get through the door the first time. I mean, I think we're remiss, and David kind of alluded to this, saying that we can keep all fraud out. It's a constant battle. And so if there's a synthetic fraud that gets through and we see that same fraudster playing in another network, we can actually tell the first node on the network, i.e. company A, let's see, versus company B, that it got through the system and we saw it in company B, and therefore you should stop them and any penetration or usage in your system. And why that matters is because we all know that, fraudsters may penetrate systems and they sit there, they become sleeper fraudsters for some time, and then they activate, and that's where you start to see a real detriment on the business. And so a bit of a long answer to your question, but we absolutely find a responsibility not just in bringing the world together to fight fraud with the right signals, but also making sure we're doing it in a way that is keeping information safe.
Yeah, and I think as we sort of look to the future, which sort of next sort of topic to sort of think about, I think David was nicely quoted as saying, "Fraud is a war between networks." And how big is their network and how big is our network? So presumably the sort of the route forward and the vision for the next sort of 3 to 6 months is building that network as quickly and as extensively as possible.
Well, and there's two tricks to it, isn't there? So as Carey said, lots of people have had the idea, I'm sure. I mean, we need a network to fight a network. I can't be the only person that's thought of that. But to do it in a way, as Carey said, where you're compliant with GDPR and you're not spraying people's personal data around and you're not making things worse, it's quite hard to work out how to do that. And so it's quite clever doing that. But actually, we're in a slightly different position because, AU10TIX already has some pretty big platforms on board anyway. So they're not starting from scratch. So in terms of sort of accelerating into this, this is a pretty strong play, to be honest, Mark. It's not starting from zero. They have big players on board already.
Yeah, Carey, I don't know if you wanted to add to that as well. Obviously, as David's saying, you've got quite a few big players on already. What are your sort of aspirations to bring more of those on in the future?
I mean, I think like any business, our desire is to grow, Mark, and do so by bringing some of the big players on. And when I joined AU10TIX about a year ago, it was after having been in this payment space for about 20 years and always having to examine that, as David said, at the root of any payment, there's a person, and you need to verify who that person is on one end and verify the person's on the other. And I joined AU10TIX not only because of the technology and the fact that they started as an API company 10 years ago. I mean, they started when I joined, we were about 40 people and we were servicing the customers that we do now. So, being always on and automated was absolutely part of our value proposition. Now, I say that because one of the other reasons that really attracted me to this company been around for 10 years, it's been serving some of these large ecosystems for 5-7 years. And what was different is we actually went to the technology space before we went to the FI space. to provide services. And it's really put us in a position of strength and credibility. And now as we start to expand more and more into the financial services space, where you're seeing more of a pull, healthcare, as I had mentioned before, you're seeing more of a pull, gaming and gambling, if, as one can imagine, people are spending more and more time online and in their spaces, they're trying to find things to occupy their time. Our goal is to continue to go after a lot of the large enterprises, but it's not to minimize the fact that we do have a portion of our portfolio that are the up and coming emerging players. And in a world where we want it to be safe and inclusive, we're going to continue to go after small businesses. But in the goal to fight fraud at scale and globally, we know we have to be where consumers are. And that means getting the brands where they spend the most time. And we're fortunate to have started there years ago, and we'll continue to do that.
Wonderful.
I'm not sure if it's clear to you, Mark, from the material, but AU10TIX made what in retrospect has turned out to be a very important technology decision. So they decided to go for a fully automated service, which obviously was much more expensive to build. But of course, as the COVID crisis has shown, means they've been able to provide an uninterrupted service. So the technology underpinning it is actually slightly different and slightly more sophisticated from some other parts of the market. I just wanted to make sure that came over to you.
Yeah, I guess as Carey was saying earlier, ideally what you want technology to do is be the swan principle, where on the top everything looks wonderfully pristine and underneath is where all the sort of action is happening. I'm guessing, as David said, by investing heavily in the technology and innovative sort of technology for that platform, that's going to enable you to move more quickly into any future sort of trends that sort of come up, and sort of predicting and moving it a little bit more in that way.
Well, I mean, obviously, me from the financial services side of things, and obviously but as Carey said, now there are places like health and education, public services, where people didn't have to work online before, and now they do. So being able to deliver a kind of, it's a very flexible service, but being able to deliver a service that has those kind of high levels of service that banks and people demand, and being able to offer that into those other areas, it's a big step forward, but it really is going to change the way people do business online. There's no doubt about it. You have universities next year that are going to be needed to enroll thousands of students and professors, and getting them to do that online is, that's a really big step. You think there's not going to be any fraud in, I mean, I don't want to get into it, but the synthetic identity fraud in education and health is just as bad as it is in financial services. It's just, you don't see it because they're not all online at the moment.
Yeah. David, Mark, if you don't mind, I actually think that's an interesting vector to go down, because all of us have focused on financial fraud. Yeah. And realistically, that's been where a majority of the fraud is, because there's benefit. And does everything go back to money and finances? At some point in time, you're only 3 degrees away from there being some sort of money movement when there's a fraud situation. But, we've talked a lot about, and I've thought a lot about, like, distortion fraud. Like, what about USC? I'm not sure, Mark, if you're familiar with the university scandal that happened, where there were some celebrities in the US that submitted their application of their children into colleges in California. And are you familiar with that at all?
No.
It was a huge scandal, and it continues to be, because they're being prosecuted as it is now. And with the submittal, they submitted falsified information, everything from what their kids were involved in to pictures that show that they were in certain sporting events, but they really weren't. And you look at that, plus the fact that they altered their SAT scores, the college admittance test, somebody else had taken that test for their child. And, that's fraud on a whole nother level that makes you start to question the credentialing and the credibility of people who are either, at a school that should be at school, or taking a class, or getting a degree that shouldn't be getting a degree, or a doctor that shouldn't be a doctor. And so, I think the world is now opened up to beyond just financial fraud. And it's something that you can fight with the same tactics that we fought financial fraud. And you mentioned being automated. I just want to emphasize this because David did a better job than I did, which is, automation is the way you're going to scale. And when you're looking
absolutely.
Now you were looking at fighting fraud with machine intelligence and neural networks and new technologies that are constantly emerging. You have to have started having a base in which those algorithms and those networks can learn. And we did that 10 years ago. And that is what's given us to where we are today. And we continue to adopt new technologies to make our system smarter than it was the day before, the year before. And that, to David's point, like, no one would have wanted this pandemic to happen. And as a leader, I've really struggled over the last couple of months because we've seen a demand for our business. Part of it because some of our competitors could not keep their SLAs during the pandemic when you saw countries and industries shutting down. Others because people recognize the criticality of this. And so we were able to grow quite quickly. At the same time, being an empathetic leader to understand we all went through this pandemic together and continue to, but we have to focus on supporting our customers, is a balancing act. But it is the technology and the automation that has been a differentiator for us, and I believe will continue to be.
Yeah, and I think obviously that's quite clear as we move further and further towards more sort of digital identity and that sort of stuff. As you sort of mentioned, digital identity is the root, the single starting point for everything else. Whether you're talking about financial fraud, education fraud, healthcare, it's like, can you prove you are who you are? Can you prove this is what it is? And I think that's one of the, thinking a little bit much further into the future. That's going to be a lot more apparent and a lot more, of interest to the general public, to businesses and everything, especially if we start thinking about cashless societies and, money moving in different ways, or even eventually the removal of money completely. Might be a bit too out there for everyone at this moment in time, but I
haven't used cash in the last 4 months. I don't know if that's the effect of not leaving my home or the fact that I didn't want to touch it.
I haven't used cash in the last probably 2 years, I would say. Apart from one, like when I was used to be able to go to the hairdressers, my hairdressers that I used to use, it was cash only. Other than that, nothing. I think it's really interesting. I think we've sort of got to sort of move along a little bit. Don't want to run up to mine. If you had some sort of final thoughts, for the audience, maybe start with you, David, and give us a short sort of overview of what you think has happened, what's going on, and a little bit for the future.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Mark, because this is all ultimately about digital identity. We have to move to a digital identity infrastructure and the lack of that infrastructure has been shown up over the last couple of months to be absolutely chaotic, So we need that infrastructure, but it all rests on this link between the person in the real world and the digital identity, and the fact that we need to know that, well, actually in many cases we don't even know it's a real person. I mean, just being able to know it's a real person is a step in the right direction. So you're absolutely right about the need for this infrastructure, and we are not the only people sitting around this morning saying, why don't we have this, why haven't we started it? But it rests on an efficient, scalable system underpinning all of this, so that you when you take it into those other areas, education and healthcare and places like that, you're not dealing with people who've got years of experience of fraud expertise and understand all the dynamics of it. And of course, the types of fraud, we don't even know what those are going to be. They're going to be completely new. So by creating this kind of strong anchor underpinning it all, we can help other people take really positive steps forward as well. So it's about the whole industry, not just about this product and the growth of this company.
Wonderful. And sort of Carey, some final thoughts from you.
I would agree with David, and I would just reiterate a point earlier, Mark, which is, fraud is a continuous collaborative fight, and there's many players that are now in the industry of fighting fraud, but it's complex. There's different vectors and derivatives of fraud, and as we want to continue to grow our economy globally, this balance of risk and ease, and the conversion of what we're trying to do becomes ever more paramount. And it's a global imperative that we protect our identities and protect each other's identities. And to do that, you have to do it as a network. I'll just add that I'm a big believer that while the national issued identity is at the core of who someone is, it's not the only thing people are. And so this notion of identities being adaptive and being contextualized, and us finding mechanisms and ways that you only share the pieces of information that are relevant for a particular transaction or use case, will aid in us protecting the information that defines us. And again, it's a world where we need to do it together, not alone. I think one of the great things coming out of the pandemic is this convergence of brands that you never thought would ever work together, whether it's Apple and Google, and creating a tracing system that are connected to their OS. We're forced to,
That's a bit of a sore topic in the UK this morning, Carey.
Sorry. I'm not saying it works, and I'm not saying that, and I know there's a lot going on, but I think there's this element of people putting their hand across the aisle and it not being so polarizing it has been in the past. And I think there's more of that to come.
No, you're spot on. This is why you've touched on something that's a huge topic in the UK this morning, because the government decided they were going to build their own stupid system. They weren't going to listen to Apple and Google, and they've thrown away all the money and they've had to scrap the whole thing. And now they're starting again with Apple and Google, because the power of those platforms is amazing. And I'm not here to fly the flag, but your experience with those platforms, I think, is pretty significant going forward. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, sounds good. I think that's kind of like the key that from this whole sort of conversation and from everything that's been going on with lockdown, as Carey said, collaboration. And that's one of the possibly, every situation should have a silver lining. And I think one of the silver linings of this terrible worldwide tragedy has been actually it's brought a lot of people a lot closer together. You can actually see the reinstigation of humanity and people wanting to help each other, and community, and all this sort of stuff, which has been absolutely phenomenal. So I think that's a really good thing, which hopefully we're going to really hold on to going forwards. That's
I hope so too.
So I'm just going to say thank you so much for both of you for spending the time to have a chat with us. We've had a really interesting conversation, and look forward to speaking again at another point. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Mark. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you. Good to see you again, David.